It was the year 1001 AD. The wind coming off the water near the new settlement was cold, even in summer. Leif Erikson's people had built a small cluster of turf houses at a place they called Landse aus Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. They were a long way from Greenland, a long way from Iceland. They were on the edge of the known world. Supplies were a constant worry. The hunting was good and the fishing was reliable, but they missed some tastes of home. More than that, they needed to find food that would last through the brutal winter. A young man named Gudrid worked with the others to build and repair the longhouse. His father Thorfinn had sailed on this expedition. He was a practical man. He knew that survival depended on more than just cod and caribou. One day he took Gudrid and a small crew south in a smaller boat. They followed the coast for weeks. The land changed, the trees grew taller and thicker. It was a warmer place. They were looking for resources, timber, game, and anything edible. In a dense forest, far down what we now call the coast of New Brunswick, they found something new. Trees with strange, hard-shelled nuts. Thorfinn recognized them as a type of walnut. He had seen similar nuts in his travels to the south of Europe as a trader. These were butternuts. They were rich in oil and protein, perfect for storing. The men spent days gathering them, filling dozens of hide sacks. It was a huge effort. The journey back north was long and dangerous. They had to paddle against the current and watch for strange tides. They traveled more than 600 miles to bring this food home. Years later, archaeologists digging through the waste heaps at Landse Meadows found the cracked shells of those butternuts. The nuts don't grow anywhere near the settlement. The nearest source was hundreds of miles south. The shells were proof. They were evidence of incredible journeys made not for glory or for raiding, but for something much more basic. Different kind of flavor. A source of fat for the winter. A surprising snack at the edge of the world. It showed that a Viking family's diet was a story of exploration, hard work, and a relentless search for anything that would keep them alive. Number 17, they ate their horses. It was the deep winter of 875 AD in a fjord north of Kaupang. The snow was piled high against the turf walls of Gunnar's longhouse. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from the central fire pit. His wife, Runa, stirred a thin porridge of barley and water. The children, a boy of 10 named Eric and a girl of 7 named Freya, were quiet. Their bellies rumbled. The salted fish was nearly gone. The dried peas were a small pile in the bottom of a clay pot. The last of the smoked mutton had been eaten a week ago. Outside in the small enclosure, their 2 horses stood in the biting wind. They were old. One was a mare named Trefna, who had plowed their fields for 15 seasons. The other was a gray gelding Sleipnir, named foolishly in youth after the god Odin's steed. He was Gunnar's riding horse, his pride. But his back was swayed, and his breath came in ragged clouds. They had served the family well. Now they were consuming precious hay that could be used to keep the single milk cow alive until spring. Gunnar sat by the fire, sharpening his long knife on a whetstone. The sound was a slow, rhythmic scrape. Runa knew what he was thinking. They had discussed it in low voices after the children were asleep. To eat a horse was not a simple thing. Horses were companions. They were a measure of a man's wealth and status. They were connected to the gods, especially Odin. To sacrifice a horse at a blot, a religious ceremony, was a powerful act. To kill one simply for meat felt different. It felt like failure. But the children's faces were thin. Freya had a cough that wouldn't go away. Hunger was a cold, creeping thing. It made the world seem gray and slow. Gunnar knew his duty. His family came before his pride. His family came before the horses. The next morning, he led Sleipnir out into the snow. The horse trusted him completely, nudging his shoulder. Eric watched from the door of the longhouse, his face grim. He had learned to ride on that horse. Gunnar spoke softly to the animal, a few words of thanks. Then, with a quick, practiced movement, he drew the knife across its throat. The work was hard and bloody. He and Runa spent the rest of the day butchering the carcass. Nothing was wasted. The meat was hung in strips from the rafters of the longhouse to smoke. The hide would be tanned for leather, the bones would be boiled for broth, then carved into tools. The intestines would be cleaned for sausage casings. That night, they ate fresh horse meat for the first time in years. Runa roasted thick steaks over the fire. The smell filled the small home, rich and savory. The meat was tough, but it was filling. It was life. The children ate without speaking, their eyes wide. The taste was strong, slightly sweet. It was not like beef or mutton. It was the taste of survival. For the next few weeks, the horse sustained them. The smoked meat was added to the porridge. The broth warmed them. It gave them the strength to face the rest of the winter. This was a scene repeated across the Viking world. While they preferred cattle, sheep, and pigs, horses were a food source in times of need. Archaeological sites from Iceland to Norway show horse bones with clear butcher marks, mixed in with the bones of other domestic animals. It was a practical choice, but it was also a cultural one. For followers of the Old Norse religion, eating horse meat, especially in a ritual context, was an affirmation of their beliefs. When Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia, this practice became a point of conflict. Christian missionaries forbade the eating of horse meat. It was seen as a pagan ritual. A pope in the 8th century specifically condemned it. For a Viking, choosing to eat horse meat or not could become a statement of faith. Some chieftains like Hakon the Good of Norway in the 10th century were pressured by their Christian advisors to stop the practice. The sagas tell of him reluctantly yielding, showing how deeply this food was tied to identity. For Gunnar's family in that cold winter, it was not about religion or politics. It was about making it to the spring thaw. It was about the hard, unspoken truth that sometimes you had to consume what you loved to keep your family alive. Number 16, their garbage tells us everything. In the summer of 1981, a team of archaeologists were excavating a site at Coppergate in the city of York, England. They were digging through layers of dark, damp, and incredibly well-preserved earth. This had been the heart of Jorvik, the Viking capital of northern England, 1,000 years before. They weren't digging up a great hall or a chieftain's grave. They were digging up a backyard. Specifically, they were excavating a wood-lined pit that had been used as a latrine, or a Viking toilet. Inside this pit was a treasure trove, not of gold or silver, but of refuse. The waterlogged, oxygen-poor soil had preserved organic materials that would normally have rotted away centuries ago. They found scraps of leather, bits of textiles, and discarded tools. But the most valuable finds were the smallest. They found thousands of seeds, fruit pits, tiny fish bones, and fragments of eggshells. They also found something even more personal coprolites, fossilized human feces. Let's imagine a family living in a house on this street in Jorvik around 970 AD. Bjarni is a craftsman who carves combs and pins from deer antlers. His workshop is at the front of the long, narrow house. His wife, Thora, manages the household. They have 3 children. Their lives are busy, caught up in the trade and bustle of the city. Their diet is a world away from their farming cousins in Norway. Each day, Thora would sweep the floor of their house. The sweeping's dust, food scraps, broken bits of pottery, straw from the floor would be tossed into the pit in the backyard. The family used the latrine, adding to the layers. What the archaeologists found in 1981 was a direct record of what Bjarni and Thora's family ate, day after day. The scientists in the lab carefully sifted through the contents of the pit. They found the pips of apples and the stones of sloes and cherries, suggesting autumn harvests and preserved fruits. They found bran fragments from wheat and rye, evidence of coarse bread being a daily food. But there were surprises. They found the seeds of grapes. Grapes didn't grow in northern England. This meant Bjarni's family was eating raisins or drinking wine imported from France or Germany, a luxury bought with the money from his antler carving. They also found raspberry and bilberry seeds, which showed the family foraged in the woods outside the city walls or bought berries from local farmers at the market. There were countless tiny bones from herring and eel, the staple fish of the urban diet. But there were also bones from larger sea fish like cod and haddock, which had to be brought inland from the coast. This pointed to a sophisticated trade network supplying the city. They found shell fragments from chicken and goose eggs, a good source of protein. They even found oyster shells, a food readily available from the nearby coast. The coprolites told an even more intimate story. When analyzed, they revealed the family's last meals. One sample was full of bread bran and the tiny, indigestible parts of leeks. It was the remains of a simple pottage or stew. Another contained pollen from the heather family, which meant the person had recently eaten honey. But the coprolites also revealed a downside to Viking life. They were riddled with the eggs of intestinal parasites like whipworm and mawworm. Life was unsanitary. These parasites would have caused chronic stomach pain and malnutrition, a constant invisible struggle for Bjarne's family. This garbage pit in York and others like it found in Viking Age towns like Hedeby in Denmark and Dublin in Ireland paints a picture of the Viking diet that sagas don't mention. The sagas talk of great feasts with roasted pigs and endless horns of ale. The garbage pits talk of the daily reality. A diet of bread, stew, foraged greens, and cheap fish. They show the small luxuries, like a handful of raisins that made life in a bustling city different. And they show the constant presence of disease and discomfort. The story of what a Viking family ate is not just written in heroic poems. It is written in their trash. Number 15, a sweet tooth was hard to satisfy. Astrid was 7 years old. She lived with her parents, Magnus and Ingrid, on a farmstead in the Malaren Valley in Sweden around the year 900 AD. Like any child, she loved sweet things, but in her world, sweetness was a rare and precious treat. There was no sugar. The white crystals that would one day dominate the world's palate were unknown in her land, a curiosity from the faraway south that only the richest traders might have heard of. Her experience of sweetness came from two main sources: fruit and honey. In the late summer, the forests and clearings around their farm would be full of berries. Astrid would go out with her mother and the other women, carrying woven baskets. They would pick wild strawberries, small and intensely flavorful. They gathered bilberries, which stained their fingers and mouths a deep purple. They collected raspberries from thorny bushes, and later in the season, lingonberries. These were eaten fresh, a burst of seasonal joy. Ingrid would also dry some of them on flat rocks in the sun, preserving a little of that summer sweetness for the long, dark winter ahead. A handful of dried berries mixed into morning porridge was a special meal. The other source of sweetness was honey. But getting honey was a difficult and dangerous business. Magnus was the one who dealt with the bees. He didn't have neat square beehives like a modern beekeeper. He managed wild bee colonies. Some were in hollow logs he had deliberately set up at the edge of the forest. These were called bee skeps. Others were high up in the hollows of old oak trees. One day in late summer, Magnus decided it was time to harvest the honey from a colony in a tall oak. He took his son Lars, who was 12, to help. Astrid watched from a safe distance. Magnus had a leather bag for the honeycomb and a small axe. He also carried a torch of damp moss, which he lit to create a thick, acrid smoke. He told Lars the smoke calmed the bees, but Lars could see it just made them confused and angry. Magnus shimmied up the trunk of the tree. As he neared the hole where the bees lived, a low, angry hum filled the air. He puffed smoke into the opening. Bees poured out, a swirling cloud of gold and black. Despite the smoke, many of them found their way to Magnus. He grimaced as they stung his hands and face, but he did not cry out. He had done this many times. He reached into the hollow with his bare hand and pulled out a large chunk of honeycomb. It was heavy and dripping with golden honey. The wax was filled with bee larvae, which were also a source of protein. He carefully placed it in the leather bag and lowered it to Lars. He took only a portion of the comb, leaving enough for the bees to survive the winter. It was important to manage the colonies, not destroy them. Back at the longhouse, the family gathered around. Ingrid scraped the honey from the wax. The honey was dark and had a strong floral taste from the heather and clover the bees had visited. It was nothing like the clear, mild honey often sold today. This honey was a treasure. It was used sparingly. A small amount might be used to sweeten a special batch of ale or mead for a festival. Ingrid might mix a spoonful with herbs to make a cough remedy. On very rare occasions, Astrid would be given a small piece of the waxy comb to chew on, a treat that was both sweet and chewy. The wax itself was also valuable. It was used for casting metal jewelry and for making candles, which were a luxury compared to the smoky tallow lamps they usually used. The rarity of sweeteners shaped the Viking palate. They were not used to the constant sweetness of a modern diet. Their main foods were savory, sour, or salty. The taste of a ripe apple, a handful of fresh berries, or a drop of honey was an intense, noteworthy event. It was a flavor they associated with summer, with festivals, and with good fortune. For Astrid, the buzz of a bee was the sound of a rare and wonderful treat, a golden sweetness that was worth the risk of a few stings. Number 14, food for a raid was not a feast. The year is 891 AD. A young man named Orm stands on the deck of a longship, the Dragon's Tooth. He is part of a crew of 40 men. They have been at sea for 2 weeks, sailing from their home in western Norway towards the coast of Northumbria. The sea spray is constant. The wind is cold. His world has shrunk to the shifting gray water, the creaking timbers of the ship, and the faces of the men around him, and the food. The food on a longship was not the stuff of feasting sagas. There was no roasted pig turning on a spit. There were no overflowing horns of mead. The food of a raider, a traveler, or a trader was about one thing: preservation. It had to be light, dense in energy, and resistant to rot. Every ounce of space on the ship was precious, needed for men, weapons, and any treasure they might acquire. There was no room for herds of live animals or barrels of fresh produce. Orm's daily ration was simple and monotonous. The foundation of his diet was dried fish. For months before the journey, the women in his village had been hanging cod and haddock on huge wooden racks. The cold, dry sea air cured the fish until it was as hard as a piece of wood. This was stockfish. It was light, and it would last for years. To eat it, Orm would gnaw on a piece directly, his strong teeth tearing at the tough fibers. Or, if they were lucky enough to make a fire on a calm day, he would smash a piece with the back of his axe and let it soften in a kettle of seawater, creating a salty, fishy soup. His other staple was a type of bread, but not bread as we know it. It was a hard, dry flatbread made from rye or barley flour, water, and salt. It was baked until it was completely moisture-free. This was a form of hardtack. It was durable enough to be used as a plate. It was often crawling with weevils by the second week at sea, but the men ate it anyway. Extra protein, the old sailors joked. To go with the fish and hard bread, they had a few other things. There was dried meat, usually mutton or goat, cut into thin strips and smoked or salted until it was tough and chewy. It was incredibly salty and made them thirsty. Water was strictly rationed. Each man had a water skin filled from a stream before they left. It was flat and tasted of leather by now. Rain was a blessing, a chance to refill their skins and rinse the salt from their mouths. There was also a barrel of soured milk, or skyr. It was a thick, yogurt-like substance that kept surprisingly well. A scoop of this provided some fat and protein and helped to break the monotony of the dry food. And they had butter packed in a wooden chest. It was heavily salted to preserve it. A small smear on a piece of hardtack was a luxury. There were no fresh vegetables, no fruit. The diet was almost entirely lacking in vitamin C. After many weeks at sea, the signs of scurvy would begin to appear. Gums would bleed, old wounds would reopen, the men would become weak and lethargic. They knew the signs, if not the cause. They called it the curse of the sea. That is why their first priority upon making landfall was not always to raid. Often it was to find a source of fresh water and to forage for greens. They would gather wild garlic, nettles, and any other edible plants they could find along the shore, eating them raw to combat the sickness. For Orm, mealtimes were not a social gathering. He would sit on his sea chest, huddled against the wind, and chew his hard food. It was fuel, it kept his muscles working at the oar, it gave him the energy to raise his shield when the time came. The dream that kept him going was not just of silver and gold, it was the dream of a hot meal. A stew of fresh meat and vegetables, a piece of soft bread, and a horn of ale that didn't taste of seawater. The food of a raider was the food of pure function, a hard-tasting testament to the hardships of a life at sea. Number 13, cooking, was a constant battle with smoke. Solveig stood over the long fire pit in the center of her family's home near Ribe, Denmark, around 850 AD. Her eyes were watering, It wasn't from sadness, it was from the smoke. The smoke was a constant companion in her life, a guest that never left. The longhouse had a hole in the roof directly above the fire to let the smoke out. But on a windy day, or when the fire was burning damp wood, the smoke would swirl and fill the large open room. It clung to the woolen clothes of her family. It seasoned the strips of meat hanging from the rafters to dry. It blackened the roof timbers over decades until they were the color of charcoal. Cooking for her family of 8 was her main task, and it revolved entirely around this single fire. She had no oven. She had no separate kitchen. The fire was the source of heat, light, and all hot food. Her most important cooking tool was a large iron cauldron that hung from a chain attached to a beam overhead. She could raise or lower the cauldron to control the temperature. This cauldron was rarely empty. For most of the year, it held a perpetual stew, or pottage. This was the foundation of the family's diet. Each morning, Solveig would add more water, some grain, usually barley or oats, and whatever else was available. It was a simple, efficient way to cook. In the summer, she would add fresh vegetables from her garden cabbage, leeks, onions, and peas. Or she would throw in handfuls of wild herbs she had gathered, like dill and coriander, to add flavor. If her husband, Rolf, had a successful hunt, she would add chunks of deer or wild boar. More often, it was a piece of salted pork or mutton from their own livestock. The stew would simmer all day. Anyone who was hungry could ladle some into their wooden bowl. It was never the same twice, yet it was always familiar. The flavors of the different ingredients would meld together over time. The bones from the meat would be left in for days, releasing their marrow and nutrients into the broth. It was a warm, filling, and nutritious meal, but not everything was boiled. Solveig also had other tools. She had a long-handled frying pan, also made of iron, which she could place on the embers. In this, she would cook eggs from their chickens or fry small fish that her sons caught in the nearby river. She also had a griddle, a flat piece of iron or stone. On this, she would cook flatbreads, simple mixtures of flour and water, which were a staple alongside the stew. For roasting, they would use spits. A whole chicken or a large joint of meat would be threaded onto an iron rod and set up on 2 posts over the fire. One of the children would have the tedious job of sitting and turning the spit slowly, ensuring the meat cooked evenly. This was usually done for special occasions like the celebration of a successful harvest. The family also had cookware made from soapstone. This soft gray stone was quarried in Norway and traded throughout the Viking world. It was easy to carve into bowls and pots. The great advantage of soapstone was that it could be placed directly into the fire without cracking, and it held heat very well. Solveig had a few precious soapstone bowls that she used for heating milk or reheating small portions of stew. Life revolved around that fire. It was the first thing lit in the morning and the last thing banked with embers at night. It was a place of work for Solveig, a place of warmth for her family, and a constant source of irritation for their eyes and lungs. Archaeologists who study Viking skeletons often find evidence of respiratory problems, a direct result of spending a lifetime breathing in wood smoke inside an enclosed space. For Solveig, the taste of every meal she ever prepared, from the simplest porridge to the most celebratory roast, was subtly infused with the flavor of wood smoke. It was the inescapable spice of her life. Number 12. Their gardens looked nothing like ours. Era walked through her small garden patch in the late summer of 920 AD. Her family's farm was nestled on the coast of Iceland, a new land her father had settled just a generation before. The soil was thin and rocky. The growing season was short and unpredictable. Her garden was not a place of colorful flowers or sprawling tomato vines. It was a small, intensely practical plot of land, a crucial supplement to the meat and fish that dominated their diet. The things she grew were hardy and adapted to the cool northern climate. There were no potatoes, no corn, no beans in the way we think of them. Those were all plants from the Americas, thousands of miles and hundreds of years away. Her garden was filled with what we might consider humble workhorse vegetables. A large section was dedicated to cabbage. Not the tight, round heads we see today, but looser, leafier varieties. Cabbage was a wonder crop for them. It grew well in the cool weather, and it could be preserved. In the autumn, Era and her mother would spend days shredding the cabbage, salting it, and packing it into clay pots to ferment, making a form of sauerkraut. The sour, pungent food would be one of their few sources of green vegetables during the long, dark winter. Next to the cabbage were rows of onions and leeks. These were prized for their strong flavor. A few chopped onions or leeks could transform a bland barley pottage into a savory meal. They were easy to grow and stored well in a cool, dry place. Garlic was also grown, though likely in smaller quantities. It was used as both a food and a medicine. There were patches of peas and broad beans, which they called horse beans. These were a vital source of protein. At the end of the season, Era would harvest the dried pods. The hard peas and beans would be stored in sacks and used throughout the winter, added to stews and soups to make them more substantial. The garden was also a source of flavor beyond the basic vegetables. Era cultivated a variety of herbs. Dill was a favorite used with fish. Hops were grown, not for vegetables, but for preserving and flavoring the ale her father brewed. She grew a plant called angelica, its tall stalks a feature of the garden. Every part of the angelica plant was used. The stems could be eaten like celery, and the seeds and roots were used for flavoring and for medicinal purposes. Caraway and mustard were also grown for their seeds, which were ground up to add a spicy kick to preserved meats. What is striking is not just what was in her garden, but what wasn't. There were very few root vegetables compared to a modern garden. They had a type of small, tough carrot, which was likely purple or white, not orange. They also had parsnips and turnips. But the potato, the staple of so many northern European diets today, was absent. The lack of this calorie-dense tuber meant that grain crops like barley and rye were even more important. Our Era's garden was not a hobby. It was a matter of survival. A bad harvest due to a cold, wet summer could mean the difference between a tolerable winter and a hungry one. She and her family were constantly working to improve the soil, adding seaweed and animal manure to the thin volcanic earth. They built low stone walls around the plot to protect the young plants from the relentless wind. The evidence for these gardens comes from archaeology. At Viking Age farm sites, scientists have found preserved seeds of these exact plants in ancient garbage pits and hearths. They have also found pollen grains trapped in the soil, which tell the story of what was cultivated 1,000 years ago. For Era, her small patch of cabbage, onions, and peas was not just a garden, it was a lifeline. Number 11, salt was more valuable than silver. Ulf the trader guided his Nar, a sturdy cargo ship, into the bustling port of Hedeby in southern Denmark. It was the year 888 AD. The ship was low in the water, heavy with its cargo, but Ulf wasn't carrying furs from the north or wine from the south. His ship was filled with something far more fundamental, something every single household needed. He was carrying salt. The salt was not the fine, white, free-flowing stuff we know today. It came in large, grayish, impure blocks. It had been produced at a salt works on the coast, a place where seawater was evaporated in large, shallow clay pans over fires, a long and fuel-intensive process. Or it had been mined from rock salt deposits far inland in Germany and brought to the coast for trade. For a Viking family, salt was not primarily a seasoning to be sprinkled on food at the table. It was the key to survival. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the main method of preserving food, especially meat and fish, to last through the winter. A family's wealth was not just in the number of cattle they owned, but in whether they had enough salt to preserve the meat from that cattle when it was slaughtered in the autumn. Let's imagine a woman named Helga, living on a farm a day's walk from Hedeby. In the autumn, her husband and sons would slaughter several sheep and a cow. This was a time of temporary abundance. They would feast on fresh meat for a few days, but the vast majority of the meat had to be preserved. This is where the salt Ulf brought to port became critical. Helga would oversee the process. Large cuts of meat would be rubbed with a thick layer of coarse salt. They would be packed into wooden barrels with more salt layered between the pieces of meat. The salt would draw the water out of the meat, making it inhospitable for the bacteria that cause rot. This salted meat, hard and intensely briny, would be their main source of protein for the next 6 months. The same process was used for fish. The herring runs in the spring and autumn were a massive source of food. The entire communities would work to catch and process thousands of fish. They would be gutted and then either packed in salt in barrels or brined in a strong saltwater solution. This salted herring was a staple food, eaten by everyone from farmhands to raiders on long voyages. Because of its importance, salt was a major trade commodity. You know, it was a form of currency. A man might trade a fine woolen cloak for a block of salt. The control of salt sources, whether coastal salt pans or inland mines, was a source of great power and wealth for chieftains and kings. The word salary itself comes from the Latin word for salt, sal, a reminder of a time when workers were sometimes paid in this precious mineral. The diet of a Viking family was, by modern standards, incredibly salty. The preserved meat and fish had to be soaked in fresh water for hours or even days before it was palatable enough to cook in a stew. Even then, the dominant flavor of many winter meals was salt. This high salt diet likely had health consequences, contributing to problems like high blood pressure, but it was a trade-off they had to make. A salty meal was better than no meal at all. Ulf the trader would sell his cargo of salt blocks in the market at Hedeby. He would trade it for amber from the Baltic, soapstone from Norway, or silver coins minted in Baghdad that had traveled the long trade routes from the east. He knew that whatever else happened, people would always need salt. It was the invisible ingredient that held their world together, the mundane yet magical substance that kept hunger at bay during the long, dark nights of winter. Number 10, your meal showed your place in the world. It is the year 990 AD in the Great Hall of a wealthy chieftain named Olaf in the Trondheim region of Norway. A feast is underway to celebrate a successful raid. The long fire pit in the center of the hall roars, casting flickering light on the faces of 50 men and women. The air is filled with the smell of roasting meat, wood smoke, and spilled ale. Everyone is eating, but not everyone is eating the same thing. Olaf sits on his high seat, a carved wooden throne on a raised platform in the middle of the hall. In front of him is a whole roasted pig, its skin crackling and brown. He uses his personal knife to carve off the best cuts of meat for himself and for his most honored guests, the leaders of the raid and a visiting merchant. They are served first. They eat the tender loin and the juicy shoulder meat. They drink the best ale, a strong, honey-sweetened brew from silver-rimmed drinking horns. Their bread is made from wheat, a finer, more expensive grain, baked into small, soft loaves. Further down the long tables sit Olaf's trusted household warriors, his huskarls. They also eat pork, but they get the less desirable cuts, the ribs, the legs. Their ale is a standard barley brew, still good but not as strong or sweet as the chieftains. Their bread is a mix of rye and barley, darker and denser. They eat well, a reward for their loyalty and strength. At the far ends of the hall, near the doors where the drafts are coldest, sit the lower-ranking members of the household. Farm workers, servants, and thralls, the enslaved people who worked the chieftain's land. They do not eat roasted pig. Their bowls are filled with the pottage that bubbles in a large cauldron at the end of the fire pit. It is a thick stew of barley, beans, and cabbage, perhaps with a few pieces of boiled mutton or salted herring mixed in. Their drink is water or a thin, weak ale, the last pressing of the grain. Their bread is a hard, coarse flatbread made from oats or even pea flour. This hierarchy of food was a fundamental part of Viking society. What you ate was a clear and public statement of your social status. The feasts were not just about celebrating, they were about reinforcing the social order. The chieftain demonstrated his wealth and generosity by providing the food, and he reinforced his authority by controlling its distribution. Giving a man a good cut of meat was a sign of favor. Giving him the gristle was an insult. This difference in diet was not just for feasts. It was an everyday reality. A wealthy land-owning family like Olaf's would eat meat or fish several times a week. Their diet would be varied, supplemented with cheese, butter, eggs, and imported goods like wine and walnuts. They had the land and the labor to produce a surplus. A poor tenant farmer or a fisherman's family lived a much more precarious existence. Their diet would be overwhelmingly based on grain porridge, flatbread, and whatever fish they could catch. Meat was a rare treat, perhaps only at major festivals. They would rely heavily on foraged foods like berries, nuts, and wild greens to supplement their meager diet. Their food was about subsistence, not choice. The thralls lived at the bottom of the food chain, both literally and figuratively. They ate what was left over. Their diet would be the most monotonous of all watery porridge, coarse bread, and perhaps the fish heads and offal that the free members of the household discarded. Archaeological evidence from Viking burial sites supports this. The skeletons of high-status individuals often show them to be taller and more robust than the skeletons of the poor. An analysis of the chemical isotopes in their bones can even reveal what they ate. The wealthy show a diet rich in meat protein, while the poor show a diet based mostly on plants and some fish. Your social standing was written into your very bones. Back in Olaf's hall, the feast continues. But it is not one feast, it is many. It is a dozen small meals, each one reflecting the status of the person eating it. For the Vikings, a meal was never just about food. It was about power. Number 9, the hardest time of year was spring. The month is April in the year 1010 AD. On a small farm in Iceland, a woman named Valdis stares at the food stores. They are almost empty. The last of the salted cod is a small dry pile in the corner of the storage shed. The barrel of fermented cabbage has been scraped clean. The sacks of barley grain are worryingly light. This time of year, what the old ones called the hunger gap, was the most dangerous time for her family. Her winter was hard, but it was predictable. They had the food they had preserved in the autumn. As long as the stores held out, they could survive the cold and darkness. But by early spring, those stores were running low. The snow might be starting to melt, but the world was not yet providing new food. The ground was still too cold to plant. The migratory birds had not yet returned. The sheep and cows were thin after a long winter of eating hay. The ewes were pregnant, but the lambs had not yet been born. The cows were giving very little milk, as most of their energy was going into their unborn calves. This was a time of gnawing, constant hunger. Valdis's husband, Ketil, and their teenage son, Bjorn, were weaker than they had been in the autumn. Their movements were slower. Every task required more effort. The children, a young boy and girl, were often quiet and listless. Their laughter, which filled the small turf house in the summer, was seldom heard. The family's diet became a grim, monotonous cycle. The main meal of the day was a thin porridge or gruel made from the last of the barley or oats, stretched with water. Sometimes, to make it seem more substantial, Valdis would stir in dried, powdered seaweed she had gathered from the shore the previous summer. It added some minerals, but did little to quell the hunger pangs. They would chip away at the last of the hard, dried stockfish. They would suck on the bones to get every last bit of flavor and nutrition. Ketil might take his boat out into the still icy fjord, hoping to catch a few early fish, but the catch was often meager. This was when the preserved foods that seem unappetizing to us were most crucial. They had a small amount of fermented shark, hakarl, buried in a pit. The ammonia smell was overpowering, but the flesh was rich in fats and calories. They ate every last scrap. They ate soured milk products, skyer and surmjock, that had been stored in barrels for months. The sharp, acidic taste was a shock to the tongue, but it was food. The first signs of new life were a cause for immense celebration. When the first green shoots of wild garlic or sorrel pushed through the damp earth, Valdis would send the children out to gather them. They would eat them raw, a burst of fresh, sharp flavor after months of salty, dry food. These first greens were not just a new taste, they were a source of desperately needed vitamin C, warding off the lingering threat of scurvy. The first seabird eggs were another treasure. Bjorn would risk his life climbing the treacherous cliffs to collect eggs from the nests of guillemots and puffins. A single egg, fried or boiled, was a feast. It was pure, fresh protein. The hunger gap was a filter. It determined who was strong enough and who had planned well enough to survive. A family that had a poor harvest the previous year or had lost livestock to disease might not make it. The sagas are filled with grim tales of spring famines, of families having to abandon their farms or starve. It was a yearly test of resilience. For Valdis, the most beautiful sight in the world was not a fiery sunset or a field of summer flowers. It was the sight of her milk cow, fat and healthy again, with a new calf by her side. It was the sound of the cow's milk hissing into the wooden bucket. That sound meant they had survived. It meant the hunger gap was over for another year. Number 8, they drank more than just mead. When we think of a Viking drinking, the image is almost always the same: a bearded warrior in a great hall, quaffing mead from a massive drinking horn. Mead was certainly important, but the everyday drinking habits of a Viking family were much more varied and much less glamorous. Let's visit the household of a farmer named Sten in Jutland, Denmark, around the year 950 AD. The day begins not with mead, but with water. The family's first drink would have been cool, fresh water from the well they had dug near their longhouse. Water was, of course, the most common drink, but they were careful about its source. They understood that water from a clear, fast-flowing stream or a deep well was safer than water from a stagnant pond. The next most common drink, especially for children and for a quick meal, was milk. But it was often not fresh milk. The fresh milk spoils quickly, so they drank soured milk or buttermilk, a byproduct of churning butter. So this was a tangy, refreshing drink that kept for longer than fresh milk. It was a good source of protein and was a constant part of the diet, especially in the summer when the cows were producing plenty of milk. The main alcoholic drink was not mead, but ale. Ale was a staple of the diet for adults. It was a source of calories and nutrients, and in a world where water could be contaminated, the brewing process made it a safer drink. Sten's wife Brynja was the brewer. The process started with grain, usually barley, but sometimes oats or rye. She would malt the grain, allowing it to sprout and then drying it to develop the sugars. This malted grain was then mashed with hot water and left to ferment with wild yeasts from the air. The resulting ale was not like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and likely had a smoky flavor from the grain being dried over an open fire. It was also not very strong. The everyday ale consumed with meals would have had a low alcohol content, perhaps similar to a small beer. It was a food beverage, a liquid bread. Stronger ale was brewed for special occasions and feasts. Hops were sometimes used to flavor the ale and help preserve it, but other flavorings like juniper or yarrow were also common. Mead, the famous drink of the sagas, was a more special occasion beverage. It was made by fermenting honey with water. Honey was a valuable and relatively scarce resource, as it had to be collected from wild bees. Making mead required a lot of honey, so it was a luxury item. A chieftain might serve mead at a great feast to show his wealth. A farmer like Sten might brew a small batch of mead for a wedding or a midwinter celebration. It was a drink for toasting, for ceremony, and for poetry. The wealthy and well-connected had access to another drink wine. Wine was not produced in Scandinavia. It was imported from the south, from the Frankish kingdoms in modern-day France and Germany. Your barrels of wine were brought north by traders and were a high-status luxury. A jarl or a king might serve wine to his most important guests. Archaeologists have found wine goblets from the Rhineland in Viking graves in Sweden, showing how prized these foreign drinks were. So the drinking landscape was diverse. A typical day for Sten's family might involve water from the well, buttermilk with the morning porridge, a horn of weak ale with the midday and evening meal of pottage, and perhaps a sip of stronger ale in the evening by the fire. The mead was saved for the gods and for special days. For the average Viking family, drinking was less about wild revelry and more about hydration, nutrition, and safety. Number 7, bread was a flat, hard affair. Kari, a young girl living in a settlement near the Trelleborg ring fortress in Denmark around 980 AD, had a daily chore. Every morning, she would take a leather bag of grain to the quern stone. The quern was made of 2 heavy circular stones, one on top of the other. The top stone had a hole in the center and a wooden handle. Kari would pour the grain, usually rye or barley, into the hole and begin to push the. It was hard, grinding work. Her shoulders and back would ache. The stone would rumble and crunch, slowly turning the hard grains into a coarse, brownish flour. This flour was the start of her family's daily bread, but the bread she helped make was nothing like a soft, airy loaf from a modern bakery. They did not have cultivated yeast in the way we do. Their ovens were rare and inefficient for bread baking. The bread of a typical Viking family was a simple, unleavened flatbread. Her mother, Liv, would take the freshly ground flour and mix it with water and a pinch of salt. She would knead the mixture into a stiff dough. Sometimes, if they had them, she might add other ingredients. Crushed peas or beans could be mixed in to stretch the flour. Seeds like linseed or caraway might be added for flavor. She would then shape the dough into small, round, flat discs. There were two ways to cook this bread. The most common was on a griddle or a flat stone placed in the embers of the central fire pit. Liv would lay the dough discs on the hot surface. They would cook quickly, puffing up slightly. The result was a smoky, slightly chewy bread, crisp on the outside and dense on the inside. It was perfect for scooping up the thick pottage that was their main meal. The other method produced a much harder, more durable bread. The dough would be shaped and then a hole would be poked in the middle. After baking, these bread rings would be threaded onto a string and hung from the rafters of the longhouse high up in the smoky air. The smoke and dry air would cure the bread until it was bone dry and hard as a rock. This was a form of hardtack. It could last for months without spoiling. It was the perfect food for travelers, sailors, and shepherds who needed to carry their provisions with them. To eat it, you would have to break a piece off and soak it in water, soup, or ale to make it soft enough to chew. Finer breads did exist, but they were for the wealthy. Sifted wheat flour could be used to make lighter, softer bread. Sometimes leavening agents like buttermilk or the foam from brewing ale could be used to make the bread rise a little. This kind of bread was a status symbol. To serve soft, wheaten bread was a sign of prosperity, but for Kari's family, the daily bread was the coarse, dark flatbread from the griddle. It was a fundamental part of their diet. The grain that went into it was the product of a full year's cycle of work. Plowing the fields with an ox in the spring, sowing the seed, weeding the crops, and the back-breaking work of harvesting with a sickle in the autumn. The final step, the daily grind at the quernstone, was a constant reminder of the effort that went into every single mouthful. The taste of that simple bread was the taste of their own labor. Number 6, the forest, was their second pantry. In the early autumn of 965 AD, a woman named Aslog left her family's farmstead in the Gotaland region of southern Sweden. She carried a large woven basket on her back. Her destination was the vast forest that began just beyond their cleared fields. The harvest of their barley and rye was complete, and the vegetables from the garden were being brought in. But her work of gathering food was not over. The forest was a vital resource, a second pantry that provided flavors, nutrients, and variety that their farm could not. Aslog was not just wandering aimlessly. She knew this forest as well as she knew her own home. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her. She knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were poisonous. Her first stop was a patch of hazel trees. She spent an hour gathering hazelnuts, which had fallen to the forest floor. These nuts were an excellent source of protein and fat. Back home, they would be cracked and eaten as a snack or ground into a paste to thicken stews during the winter. They were a precious source of calories for the cold months. Next, she moved deeper into the woods, to a clearing where berry bushes grew in abundance. The raspberries were gone, but the lingonberries were ripe, small, red, and tart. She picked them carefully. Lingonberries were special because they contained a natural preservative, benzoic acid. This meant they could be stored in water in a cool place for a long time without spoiling. A bowl of these tart berries in the middle of winter was a welcome shock of flavor. She also gathered rose hips, the bright red fruit of the wild rose, which she knew were full of goodness and could be dried to make a healthy drink. Aslog also kept her eyes open for mushrooms. She was extremely careful, only picking the types she knew were safe, like chanterelles and seps. Mushrooms were a savory, meaty addition to their pottage. They would be eaten fresh or threaded onto a string and hung up to dry for later use. She gathered herbs as well. She picked wild marjoram and thyme to season their preserved meats. She found a patch of wild garlic, digging up the small bulbs to add a pungent kick to their cooking. This foraging was not just a summer and autumn activity. Even in the spring, the forest provided. After the long winter, when the food stores were low, the first green shoots were a lifesaver. Aslog and her children would gather nettles, which, when boiled, made a nutritious green vegetable rich in iron and vitamins. They would pick young dandelion leaves and sorrel to add to their meals. The forest also provided food that wasn't plant-based. Her husband, Ivar, would hunt in these woods, tracking deer, wild boar, and elk. He would set traps for smaller animals like hares and squirrels. Even birds like capercaillie and grouse were a welcome addition to the pot. Like, this reliance on wild, foraged food was a key part of the Viking diet. It provided a safety net. If the grain harvest was poor, a good nut and berry harvest could help see them through the winter. It also provided essential nutrients that were often lacking in a diet heavy on grain and preserved meat. The vitamins and minerals from fresh greens, berries, and nuts were crucial for health. Archaeological evidence confirms this. In the remains of Viking settlements, scientists have found the charred shells of hazelnuts, the seeds of various berries, and the pollen of edible wild plants, all mixed in with the evidence of farmed crops. For Aslog, the forest was not a wild, dangerous place. It was a garden, one that she did not have to plant, but one that she had to know intimately to reap its rewards. Number 5, fish was the real king of meals. We often picture Vikings as fierce warriors feasting on giant legs of mutton. And while they did eat meat for a huge portion of the population, especially those living near the coast or along rivers, fish was the true center of their diet. It was more reliable, more plentiful, and more important for daily survival than any farm animal. Consider the life of a man named Finn, who lived in a small fishing village in the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway in the year 870 AD. His entire world was shaped by the sea and the fish within it. He was not a farmer. The rocky islands where he lived were unsuitable for growing much grain. His wealth, his food, and his family's survival depended on his catch. Finn's life followed the rhythm of the fish. In the late winter and early spring, the great migration of Atlantic cod, the scray, would arrive from the Barents Sea to spawn. This was the most important time of the year. Finn and every other able-bodied man in the village would go out in their open boats, facing the icy winds and dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. They used long hand lines with baited hooks, often made of iron or weights and jigs. The work was brutally hard and cold. But the reward was immense. They would return to the village with their boats laden with cod, sometimes weighing over 50 pounds each. The entire village would then turn into a production line. The women and children would be waiting on the shore. They would gut and clean the fish immediately. Almost none of this fish was eaten fresh. It was far too valuable. It was their harvest for the entire year. The fish were processed for preservation. Some would be salted, but in the cold, dry climate of Lofoten, the most common method was air drying. The cod were tied together in pairs by the tail and hung over large wooden racks called gel. For months, the fish would hang there, exposed to the sun and the wind, until they became completely dehydrated and as hard as a board. This was stockfish. This stockfish was Finn's livelihood. It was a perfect food for preservation and trade. It was lightweight, packed with protein, and would last for years. Finn would keep a portion for his own family to eat throughout the year. The rest would be loaded onto trading ships and sold. Lofoten stockfish was a prized commodity, traded all across the Viking world and beyond. It was carried on long ships to England, traded for wheat. It was taken by merchants to the markets in Hedeby, where it was exchanged for pottery and glass. For Finn's family, fish was on the menu almost every day. Their daily pottage would be based on stockfish, which would be hammered into smaller pieces and soaked to rehydrate it before being added to the pot. They ate other fish as well. In the summer, they caught coalfish haddock and halibut. In the autumn, the herring would run and they would catch them in nets in the fjords, preserving them in barrels of brine. They collected shellfish from the shore and fished for trout and salmon in the freshwater streams. Even the parts of the fish we might discard were used. The cod livers were pressed to make a rich, nutrient-filled oil, which was used both as a food supplement and as fuel for lamps. The heads were dried and sometimes used to make a thin, fishy broth. Nothing was wasted. The importance of fish is seen everywhere in the archaeological record. Massive piles of fish bones are found at coastal Viking settlements, far outnumbering the bones of farm animals. Chemical analysis of Viking skeletons from these areas shows that their diet was predominantly marine-based. For Finn, the sight of a school of herring turning the water silver or the feel of a heavy cod on his line was not just a job. It was the promise of life itself. Meat was for feasts, fish was for survival. Number 4, they were masters of making food last. The summer of 998 AD had been good to a farming family in central Denmark. The harvest was plentiful, the cows were fat, and the apple trees were heavy with fruit. But for the matriarch of the family, a woman named Signy, the end of summer was not a time for rest. It was the beginning of the most important work of the year, preservation. The bounty of the summer and autumn was useless if it couldn't last through the 6 months of winter and early spring. Signy's kitchen, the area around the long fire in her home, became a whirlwind of activity. Every method of food preservation known to her people was put to use. It was a complex and labor-intensive process that required immense skill and knowledge. Salting was one of the primary methods. Her husband and sons had slaughtered a pig and 2 sheep. The meat was cut up. The best cuts were rubbed with coarse salt and packed tightly into wooden barrels. The salt drew out the moisture, creating an environment where bacteria could not grow. This salted pork and mutton would be their main source of meat through the winter. The same was done with herring caught during the autumn run, creating barrels of salty, preserved fish. Drying was another key technique. Long, thin strips of beef were hung from the rafters of the longhouse. The constant smoke from the fire pit would slowly dry and cure the meat, turning it into a form of jerky. This smoked meat had a wonderful flavor and would last for a very long time. Out in the yard, apples were sliced into thin rings, threaded onto strings, and hung up in the sun to dry. Peas were left on the vine until the pods were dry and brittle, then harvested and stored in cloth sacks. Fermentation was a more complex, almost magical process. Signy shredded cabbages from her garden, layered them with salt in a large clay crock, and pressed them down until the juices ran. The crock was then covered and left in a cool place for several weeks. Natural yeasts and bacteria would go to work, transforming the sharp, raw cabbage into tangy, sour sauerkraut. This not only preserved the cabbage, but also increased its nutritional value with B vitamins. Milk was also fermented. It was allowed to sour and thicken, creating products similar to yogurt and kefir, which would last much longer than fresh milk. This was the origin of skyr, the thick, protein-rich dairy product still famous in Iceland. For their dairy, they also made butter and cheese. The cream was skimmed from the milk and churned into butter. The butter was then heavily salted to preserve it. The remaining milk was used for cheese-making. Rennet, an enzyme from a calf's stomach, was added to the milk to make it curdle. The curds were then separated from the whey, pressed into molds, and left to age. These hard, salty cheeses were a compact and long-lasting source of fat and protein. Even burial was a preservation method in some places, particularly Iceland. The fatty flesh of the Greenland shark is toxic when fresh. To make it edible, it would be buried in a shallow, gravelly pit and covered with stones. The pressure would squeeze out the toxic fluids, and the shark would ferment for several months. Then it was dug up, cut into strips, and hung to dry. The result, hakarl, has a famously strong taste and smell, but it was a valuable source of food. As for Signy, this was a race against time. She had to get all this food processed and stored before the first hard frost and the damp rot of late autumn set in. Her family's life depended on her success. A barrel of salted meat that went bad, a batch of cheese that grew the wrong kind of mold could be a disaster. Her knowledge was a form of wealth passed down through generations. The contents of her storehouse in November, the barrels of salted fish, the strings of dried apples, the crocks of fermented cabbage, and the wheels of hard cheese dough were a testament to her skill and a guarantee that her family would see the spring. Number 3. Dairy was eaten, not drunk. On a green, windswept hillside in Iceland around the year 1025 AD, a woman named Halla milked her family's cows. The milk hissed into the wooden pail. It was a precious resource, the lifeblood of their farm. But once it was in the pail, it was very unlikely that anyone in her family would drink it as a fresh, cold glass of milk. For Halla and her family, milk was not primarily a beverage. It was a raw ingredient, the starting point for a whole range of processed dairy foods that were central to their diet. The reason was simple: preservation. Fresh milk spoils within a day or two without refrigeration. For a Viking family, consuming all their milk fresh was impossible and wasteful. More importantly, many adult Vikings, like many people around the world today, were likely lactose intolerant. They lacked the enzyme to properly digest the lactose in fresh milk, which could cause stomach upset. The processes of fermenting milk and making cheese break down the lactose, making the nutrients in the milk accessible to everyone. So, what did Halla do with the milk? After letting it sit, she would skim the cream from the top. This cream was churned in a wooden dash churn, a laborious process of agitating the cream until the fat clumped together. This was butter. The butter was then washed and kneaded with salt. The salt was crucial. A well-salted butter could be packed into a wooden firkin and stored in a cool place or even buried in a bog for months. It was a vital source of fat, especially during the winter. Like a thick smear of salty butter on a piece of coarse flatbread was a delicious and energy-rich meal. What was left after churning was buttermilk. This tangy, low-fat liquid was one of the few dairy products consumed as a drink. It was refreshing and kept longer than fresh milk. The skimmed milk that was left over was the key ingredient for other products. A large portion of it was used to make skyr. Halla would gently heat the milk and add a small amount of old skyr as a starter culture, similar to making yogurt. She might also add a little rennet. The milk would set into a thick curd. This curd was then strained through a cloth bag for several hours, allowing the watery whey to drip out. The result was skyr, a thick, dense, sour, and protein-packed food, almost like a soft cheese. It could be eaten plain or mixed with berries in the summer. It was a staple food, providing a huge amount of protein. The whey that was drained off was not discarded. Nothing was wasted. This sour, watery liquid called sira in Old Norse was also a preservative. Meat or fish could be stored in barrels of whey. The acidity of the whey pickled the food, allowing it to be kept for a long time. This method was particularly common in Iceland. Cheesemaking was also a major use for milk. Rennet was used to curdle the milk, and the resulting curds were pressed to remove the whey, salted, and then aged. The cheeses they made were likely hard, dry, and salty, designed for long-term storage rather than complex flavor. These cheeses were a portable, durable source of calories and protein, perfect for a long journey or for a shepherd watching his flock. The archaeological record is full of evidence for this intensive dairy processing. Traces of milk fats have been found absorbed into the pottery of Viking-age cooking pots and bowls. Large numbers of animal bones found at farm sites are from very young calves, suggesting they were slaughtered so that the milk from their mothers could be used by the human family. For Halla, her cows were not just a source of a drink, they were the engine of a small food factory, turning grass into butter, cheese, and skyr, the foods that formed the backbone of her family's diet. Number 2, meat was often a side dish. It is an ordinary evening in the year 900 AD at a modest farmstead in the Danish countryside. A family gathers around the central fire for their evening meal. The father, Carl, his wife, Birgit, and their 3 children sit on simple wooden benches. Birgit ladles food from the iron cauldron into their wooden bowls. The bowl is filled with a thick, steaming pottage. It smells of barley, onions, and herbs. This is their dinner. If we could look into that bowl, what would we see? We would see a meal dominated by plants. The base of the stew is grain, probably barley, which has been cooked for hours until it is soft. There are pieces of cabbage, leeks, and peas from their garden. There are wild herbs for flavor, and, if they are lucky, there are a few small pieces of meat or fish floating in the thick broth. The popular image of the Viking diet is one of huge feasts and mountains of meat. While these feasts certainly happened among the wealthy elite, the daily reality for the vast majority of the population was very different. For a family like Carl and Birgit's, meat was not the centerpiece of the meal. It was a flavoring, a supplement, a way to add richness and protein to a diet that was primarily based on grains and vegetables. Their farm had a few cows, a dozen sheep, a couple of pigs, and some chickens, but these animals were far too valuable to be slaughtered regularly for daily meals. The cows were essential for milk, which was turned into butter and cheese, and for pulling the plow. The sheep provided wool for their clothing. The chickens gave them eggs. Animals were typically slaughtered in the autumn. This was a practical decision. It was difficult to provide enough fodder to keep a large number of animals alive through the winter. A slaughter in the autumn provided a brief period of fresh meat, but most of it was immediately preserved by salting, drying, or smoking. This preserved meat was then used sparingly throughout the winter and spring. A typical week's meals for Birgit's family might look something like this. The foundation of almost every meal would be either porridge grot or the perpetual pottage stew. The porridge was made from barley or oats, cooked with water or a little milk. The pottage was a slow simmered stew of grains, beans, and vegetables. On most days, this pottage would be entirely vegetarian, or perhaps flavored with a piece of salted pork fat or a handful of dried herring. Maybe 2 or 3 times a week, Birgit would add a small amount of preserved meat to the pot. A few chunks of salted mutton or smoked pork shared among the 5 of them. It was enough to give the stew a meaty flavor and provide some valuable fat and protein, but it was far from a meat-heavy meal. Though fresh meat was a rare treat, it might be eaten after the autumn slaughter, or if an animal had an accident and needed to be killed. A successful hunt for a deer or a wild boar would also provide fresh meat, which would be a cause for celebration. But this was not a daily or even weekly occurrence. The diet was heavily reliant on what they could grow and store. Cereals like barley, rye, and oats were the staff of life. They were eaten as porridge, in stews, and as flatbread. And vegetables from their garden cabbage, onions, peas, beans were essential. Dairy products like skyr, cheese, and butter provided crucial fat and protein. Fish, especially for those near the coast or rivers, was a more common source of animal protein than meat from livestock. The sagas and poems written by and for the aristocracy focus on the feasts of chieftains because they were exceptional events. You know, they don't dwell on the daily reality of a farmer eating barley porridge, but for the average Viking family, a meal was a humble, plant-based affair, with meat serving as a precious occasional addition rather than the main event. Number 1, they traveled hundreds of miles for a snack. Around the year 1000 AD, a small group of Norse explorers stood on a windswept coast in a new world. They had sailed from Greenland, following tales of a land to the west. They established a small temporary settlement at what is now Lanceos Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. They were perhaps 100 people, a tiny outpost of Europe on the edge of a vast unknown continent. Their primary concern was survival. They needed to find food, timber, and resources to sustain them through the harsh winter and to justify their perilous journey. Among the people in this settlement was a young man named Traff. His life here was a mixture of hard labor and exploration. He helped build the long, turf-walled houses that were their shelter. He fished for cod and salmon in the nearby bay. He hunted caribou in the sparse woodlands. The diet was sufficient, but it was limited. It was the food of survival. One day, the leader of the expedition, perhaps Leif Erikson himself, or a later explorer like Thorfinn Karlsefni, decided to send a party south. The land to the south, they had heard from earlier scouting trips, was different, it was warmer, and the forests were richer. Rafnin was chosen to be part of the crew of a smaller, more nimble boat, a fairing, or a small nar. Their mission was to explore and to forage, to find anything of value that this new land, Vinland, had to offer. They sailed south from the northern tip of Newfoundland, following the coastline. The journey took weeks. They would have sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a vast inland sea. The landscape changed dramatically. The low windswept tundra gave way to dense forests of maple, oak, and other hardwood trees they had never seen before. This was a new and bewilderingly rich environment. In the river valleys of what is now New Brunswick, they found something they recognized, or at least a relative of something they knew. It was a type of walnut tree. The specific tree was the butternut. These trees were laden with nuts in their thick green husks. For Raffin and the others, this was a significant find. Hazelnuts were a valued food back home in Scandinavia, a source of fat and protein that could be stored for winter. These butternuts were even larger and richer. The men spent several days camped in this valley. They gathered hundreds of pounds of the nuts, filling hide sacks with them. It was a laborious process. They also likely gathered wild grapes, the fruit that may have given Vinland its name. But the nuts were the real prize. You know, they were a dense, storable, high-energy food source. You know, the journey back north was arduous. They had to paddle and sail against prevailing winds and currents. Their small boat was now heavily laden with sacks of nuts. The entire round trip was a journey of over 1,200 miles. It was an expedition on an epic scale, undertaken not for gold or for conquest, but for food. Back at Lanso Meadows, the butternuts were a welcome addition to their diet. They were a new flavor, a taste of the rich lands to the south. They were cracked open by the fire in the evenings, the rich meat of the nut, a welcome relief from dried fish and meat. The oil from the nuts would have been a valuable source of fat. 1,000 years later, archaeologists excavating the Norse settlement at Lansay Aus Meadows found the proof of Raffin's journey. In the refuse pits, mixed in with the fish bones and charcoal, they found the cracked shells of butternuts. Butternut trees do not grow in Newfoundland. The nearest place they grow naturally is in the St. Lawrence River Valley, over 600 miles to the south. Those small, discarded shells tell an astonishing story. They are evidence of the incredible distances the Vikings were willing to travel, the risks they were willing to take, not just for raiding and trading, but to supplement their diet. Well, they showed that the foraging of a Viking family could extend across oceans and continents. The simple act of eating a handful of nuts by the fire in a turf house in Newfoundland was the final link in a chain of exploration, labor, and travel on a scale that is hard to comprehend. It proves that for the Vikings, the search for something good to eat could be the motivation for the grandest of adventures.